the public transport customer satisfaction metrics overview. And I think it's Stacey, the Executive General Manager of Public Transport, and Vanessa, Executive General Manager of Customer Experience. And basically we're going to be looking at the various methodologies used to measure customer satisfaction across the public transport network, and that's certainly been a recurring question with a number of councillors in their questions. So it'll be useful to get a bit more of a sense of how those methodologies play out. Welcome, Stacey.
Thank you, Chair. I know there's been a lot of conversation in months past about how we measure customer satisfaction, and I do recall being here and us looking at a graph, and that felt non-representative in terms of the sentiment that councillors were receiving from their constituents. So we did want to take you through a little bit more detail to help you understand it, and the additional measures that we do more on an operational basis to give us sort of weekly insights to things. So in terms of that, there are currently 2 PT satisfaction surveys, and both surveys evaluate the performance of Auckland public transport services. The results are reported to various stakeholders across AT. The first one is the Gravitas survey, and that's actually done on board public transport. And that is done quarterly, and it is reported through to Waka Kotahi. So it is a consistent measure used. And as an example of that, it will say, because it's on board, it's done in person, and in terms of that, it is about your experience on board, and is your service sort of running to time? And you do get what I call a much higher satisfaction rate being there on the spot with that. Our second one is what we call AT's internal online survey, and we call that the weekly pulse of the network, and satisfaction is for the most recent journey. It is a lag survey in terms of that is an opt-in basis, so it is quite different, and they're also measured differently, so we'll have a wee look at that. So the official Waka Kotahi New Zealand Transport Agency survey is a prescribed methodology which has been carried out on behalf of AT since October 2012. It is a paper-based survey carried out every 3 months. It is done on board our services, and that's across all the modes, and it measures satisfaction with a range of different elements of the current trip and the overall PT system. So there are questions in that survey such as the infrastructure questions as well as the cleanliness of the fleet and the punctuality of the trip that you're actually on at the time. It reports satisfaction as a 6+ out of 10 measure. Now that's a key difference to consider when we look at the next one. It is reported as a 12-month rolling average, which smooths out the season variability as well. And it's used in performance metrics and at contracts with PT providers. So it is done by operator and regionality as well. So the total sample is usually about 3,100 per quarter, and it's done over a set period, a few weeks. And in terms of our online one, this was only something that we actually brought in during COVID, because probably for obvious reasons we weren't feeling as close to our customers and understanding their experience given the situations that we were in and the distance measures. It is done online, and it's done by actually issuing emails out on a weekly basis to registered hot cards, and so that's done to people who had a journey in the last week. In terms of that, it is obviously an opt-in survey. People are being asked to do that. They don't have to do it in terms of that. And it has a subset of on-board sort of questions such as journey planning, disruptions, and those sort of topical issues. Every now and then there are different questions that are asked if we're looking to obtain different information from our customers. It reports an 8 out of 10 satisfaction, which is quite different to the Gravitas survey, which is the official customer satisfaction measure. So it's a lot more what I would call looking at the really satisfied end of it. But what it does do is it has text elements where customers can tell us exactly about their journey. And we use that every week to understand our customers, particularly around disruptions and the likes, because we get pointed feedback, let's say, or sort of targeted feedback about particular areas. Again, this is used at approximately 300 per week we get, which sort of equates to around the same sort of numbers in terms of quarterly, so 3,600 per quarter. That is, I guess, an example in terms of how it measures out on the same surveys with the different measures. So 6 out of 10 for the official one, it's an 8 out of 10 satisfaction measure for the online one. There's good reasons for that. It does provide us with what I would call a pulse in terms of that. It's important to also understand that when you're asking people to opt in and do something, usually they're only going to do that if they're really, really satisfied or they've had a really bad experience and they want to tell you about that. So it does eschew the overall sort of what I call satisfaction, but it's important for us to be able to hear that and understand why, and that's why we do it that way. This is just more in terms of how you can see how it's tracked over the period of time across both sort of survey formats. What you are likely to hear, and what I know was up there last time when this came up, was you saw the Gravitas survey. You saw the one that's done on a quarterly basis where there is a very high level of satisfaction on the 6 to 10 index, which is the official one done nationally. Okay. What you've been hearing is more where it hasn't worked well for customers, which is very much more aligned to what we do with the pulse check. And so likely, you're not hearing every day from people when they've had a good bus journey or a good train journey or a good ferry journey. You're hearing when it doesn't work for them. And that sort of aligns with how we do the surveying as well. So we get that real-time information each week. And that's it. Thank you.
So thanks very much for that presentation, Stacey. Do we have any questions from the councillors? That's it, yeah. Okay. Councillor Hills, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a brief, and it's maybe connected to this. Are we measuring the people, individuals, rather than numbers? Because I have a sneaking suspicion that we're doing a lot better, but because people take public transport less often, the numbers are obviously fewer. So I feel like there are more people taking public transport than pre-COVID, but just doing it less. So we're kind of not celebrating that bit just because maybe there's more people but taking it 3 days a week instead of the 5 they always used to.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, that's correct. There are more unique, what I would call public transport users. It's just that those that were taking public transport 5 days a week are potentially only taking it 2 or 3 days a week. But more people are using it. Yeah.
Thanks, Councillor Hills. I'll just chuck one in, Stacey, if you don't mind. And just trying to really, I can see the overall difference between the two in terms of what you're asking. When you use the term with this service, is it that particular run that day, or more generically the service, that you use last year or 2 years or whatever it might be?
Thank you, Chair. With the Gravitas one, it is on board. It is about the service that you're on at that particular time. But of course, other people's sentiment will come into it about things. With the online survey, it is very much about your experience. They will say that, we've noticed you're on this trip. How was your experience that day? And so whilst it goes out to a really large number, obviously not everybody's going to respond to it. We do see people in terms of want to tell us about their disruption on their particular service. They may bring other things into it, which is, to be expected in terms of general sentiment across the board.
I guess just a quick follow-up question for that, and I can see the methodologies here, is probably what we're interested in is like a sense of what's people's overall satisfaction with their service. So is there any, is there provision to hit like certain routes, whether bus, train, or ferry, and you have a more kind of like thorough examination than's covered here? So is there anything over and above these surveys that AT has done or can do?
Thank you. Yes, good question. We do a lot in terms of surveying to understand, how people connect with public transport, how often they use it, what are the inhibitors in terms of accessing public transport. There's regular sort of surveys to understand sentiment across the board. The Gravitas one's quite in-depth. There are a lot of questions they will ask, how do you usually travel, in terms of how often do you use public transport. So we do get detailed information. So whilst you see that high-level graph, there's a considerable amount of data that sits behind it that we do go through thoroughly quarterly to understand changes in behaviour, and also in terms of sentiment towards the likes of infrastructure, fleet cleanliness, customer service and responsiveness, information during disruption.
Councillor Simpson?
Stacey, are you finding the increase to full fare public transport subsidy that's gone off affecting public transport use?
That's a great question, Councillor. No, we're not, interestingly enough. It hasn't really impacted what I would call is our core commuting market. We haven't seen a drop-off. We have seen, obviously, an increase in terms of with the particular user groups where those fare subsidies are in place. We've seen more registrations in that space, which we would expect to see. But in terms of what we saw before half price came off, no, we're not seeing a dip there.
That's amazing.
Surprising. Okay, so thank you very much, Stacey, for that presentation. I'm happy to move it. I have a seconder, Councillor Fletcher. Does anyone want to say anything, speak to it? No? Okay, done a good job there, Stacey. So all those in favour? Right. Okay, against? Carried. Move on to the next item, item 10, approval of Auckland